Now I would like to introduce the person who is responsible for our keynote speaker being here. And she asked that I make a short introduction because she's not the keynote this morning. But I just want to say that I've been a longtime fan of Ping, and Ping Fu has been a longtime fan of COFES, one of our strongest supporters, and we're very grateful to her for many, many things. So if you would please give a warm welcome to Ping Fu of Geomagic this morning.
Being short, so I need to adjust the microphone. I'm Ping, this is Bo, and Ping is FOB, means friends of both. Maybe you're all going to join me as FOBs. Bo is one of the most respected journalists for entrepreneurs, and he's editor at large at Inc. magazine. That's where I met him. He co-authored several books with FOBs. One of it you have, which is Neck with Norm Brodsky, and they too also write a column called Street Smarts, and you can find them at inc.com. Fabulous column, I always follow that. And the Small Giant book was nominated as one of the business book, one of the finalists for Business Book of the Year by Financial Times. And since then, there's so many people resonate with this concept that there's almost like a renaissance movement for business. So Bo is the chairman of Small Giant Community and global organization dedicated to connect people in pursuit of business Mojo. So you all have Mojo buttons there. Since I met Bo, my life changed because I met so many interesting people, and it's kind of poetic to say that we feel like soulmates. But this morning, I found out that Bo, in college, actually owns a college radio station called Soul Sound, and his nickname, and maybe not nickname, he's known as King of Soul. So here at Bo Burlingham.
Thank you very much, Ping. Okay, now it's my turn to try and make this work here. Excuse me for 1 second. There we go. Am I there? No, is it one over? Here? Okay, great. Well, now you know what my strong suit isn't. It's really great to be here. I have to say, it's frankly an honor to be introduced by Ping Fu, who's one of my heroes. And I also have to take my hat off to Brad and Joel and Kelly and the other people running this conference. This has to be the most efficient conference I have ever been to. And so I think they deserve a round of applause. I want to talk to you this morning about this question. And it's what I'd like you all to sort of be thinking about as I'm talking. Because it's really the central question that is posed by the companies in my book. Let me tell you a little bit about my perspective on this question. I joined Inc. magazine in January of 1983, so I've been there more than 27 years now. And when I actually got to Inc. magazine, it was pretty much a startup. It was less than 4 years old. It was growing like crazy. We'd be adding 50,000 new subscribers every 2 months. And it was a very exciting time to be there. But it was exciting not just because of what was happening in the company. Even more, it was exciting because of what was going on outside the company. It's what I think of as the birth of the entrepreneurial economy. Now, some of you may be too young to remember it, but there was a time when it wasn't considered a compliment to call somebody an entrepreneur. In fact, it was sort of a put-down. You know, that guy's a real entrepreneur, like he had gold watches up his sleeve or something. You know, and the business press, academia paid no attention to entrepreneurs, and neither did the business press at all. But that was beginning to change in the early 1980s. And I like to think that Inc. had something to do with that. Frankly, Ronald Reagan had something to do with that as a president who celebrated entrepreneurship. But mainly it was changing because of the companies themselves. They were changing the popular image of what entrepreneurship was all about. And I had the great stroke of fortune to wind up in a place where I could get to know a lot of these companies and their leaders when they were still pretty young. I'm talking, for example, about Microsoft, which was on our Inc. 500 list in 1983. You may recognize a couple of the people there. Here's a better shot of one of them. It was, you know, so it was Microsoft and Bill Gates, and it was Steve Jobs and Apple, and Tom Stenberg and Staples, and Tom Golisano and Paychex, Anita Roddick and The Body Shop, Yvonne Chouinard, you know, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield at Ben & Jerry's, and so forth and so on. It was just really an extraordinary moment in business history, and through sheer luck, I wound up right in the middle of it. And back then, I began to notice that the best of these companies had something very, very special going for them. It wasn't just that they were very successful by all the usual measures of success in business, which they all were, but there was something else they had. It was a kind of a magnetism. It was a power of attraction. It's something you could feel as soon as you came into contact with these companies. Now, I didn't have a name for it then, but I do now. It's what I call Mojo. Okay, everybody, this is Mojo. And by that, what I mean is the business equivalent, basically the organizational equivalent of charisma. You know, when a leader has charisma, you want to follow him or her. When a business has mojo, you want to be associated with that business. You want to buy from it, you want to sell to it, you want to work for it, you want to wear its T-shirts and caps. When articles are written about it, you want to be sure to read those articles. If its leaders are speaking someplace or are going to be at a conference, you want to make sure you go to that conference. It's what you feel when you're in the presence of greatness in business. Now, let me just talk for a minute about why I think this is important to everybody and particularly important to you. I'm going to tell you a couple of things you already know. Number one, of all the factors that determine whether or not a business is successful, the most important, bar none, is the quality of the team. You can have the most terrific concept, you can have the greatest business model, you can have the most brilliant strategy. They aren't worth anything unless you have the people who can execute them. Number two, the competition for those people is fierce and getting fiercer. I don't know how many of you saw the front page of the Wall Street Journal yesterday, but the lead article was about how the competition for talent in the technology sector was heating up. There were already bidding wars going on again, and it was going to get, you know, just more and more intense as in the months and years ahead. So, you know, actually one statistic that is of that you might find of interest is that the average salary of somebody working in a venture-backed company these days is $100,000. That's just one measure of the demand for the best people. So the question is, how do you attract and keep them? You know, salary and perks take you only so far these days. And frankly, stock options take you only so far. You got to be competitive in both areas, but you also have to have something else going for you. I submit it's the opportunity to work for a great organization and to be part of a great organization, to contribute something great and unique to the world. In a word, it's Mojo. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about how, let me just say that I've had the great fortune, actually, to work, spend a lot of time around companies with tons of Mojo for the last, for most of my adult life, but in particular the last 10 or 15 years. And I write about 14 of them in my book, Small Giants. You'll notice that the subtitle is Companies That Choose to Be Great Instead of Big. I am well aware that that may not be a choice you want to make. There are a lot of people who want to be great and big. There are a lot of companies that are already big and want to be great. There are a lot of companies that are small and will never really have the chance to get big, but they want to be great too. I think there are things about the companies in my book that we can all learn from. Why? Because in business, it's very easy to confuse getting bigger with getting better and size with greatness. You know, by choosing to go for greatness over bigness, a company, and the companies in my book have made that choice because they have other goals that they consider more important than getting as big as possible, as fast as possible. And by choosing to take that route, they remind us that bigness and greatness are not the same thing, and they put that question on the table that I started out with. Namely, what exactly is it that makes a company great? Different people will have different answers to that question, and that's fine. But I think we all do ourselves a favor by thinking about the possibilities and by asking ourselves, okay, what exactly is it that we want out of business, out of work, and out of life? Now, let me tell you how I got onto this question. I can't really see the audience. I usually ask if there's anybody here who went to the University of Michigan and have spent time in Ann Arbor. Because if you have, you know what Zingerman's is. You know about Zingerman's. Zingerman's started out in 1982 as a delicatessen. It was started by two guys, Ari Weinzweig and Paul Saginaw, who decided that they wanted to, that what Ann Arbor really was missing was a great corned beef sandwich. And they decided that they were going to start a delicatessen where you could get great corned beef sandwiches. In fact, you could get great all kinds of sandwiches. They wanted to create a business and a delicatessen which was going to be unique. It wasn't going to be an imitation of the delicatessens that you would find in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago. It was going to be something unique to Ann Arbor, and it was going to become world famous. Well, lo and behold, 10 years later, 1992, they'd accomplished that goal. Zingerman's had been written up in the New York Times and Bon Appetit and Gourmet, Esquire magazine, and whenever anybody who knew about delicatessens put together a list of the greatest delicatessens in the world, Zingerman's was on it. So they reached a point that a lot of successful companies get to, where they had to decide, okay, what are we going to do next? Where are we going to go next? They knew they wanted to grow, but they weren't sure they felt comfortable with the standard model. They had lots of options. You know, because they were so successful, they could have franchised. They had people all over the country who were asking them to set up Zingerman's in other college towns, in Columbus, Ohio, or Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California, or whatever. So that was one possibility. Frankly, they could have raised private equity and done the same thing. They had a great specialty food brand, at a time when all the big grocery store chains were looking for that, so they could have taken that route as well. But they said to themselves, look, we started this company in order to create something great and unique. And when you start replicating something, it's no longer unique by definition, and a lot of times it isn't even very good, let alone great. So they said they weren't going to take that route. They were going to do something else, but they weren't sure what. And for the next 2 years, Ari and Paul sat on a bench every week, once a week, and thought about what they were going to do next. And they talked to everybody in the organization. They talked to people outside the organization. They finally came up with a plan, which they launched in 1994. And it was called Zingerman's 2009. And it was their vision of what the company was going to look like 15 years in the future. Which is, already quite an accomplishment. But they had this idea that instead of trying to make this delicatessen bigger and bigger, or spreading it out, or franchising it, or what have you, they were going to set up other businesses in the Ann Arbor community, all of which were going to be food related, and each of which was going to be great and unique in its own right. When I went to visit them in 2002, they were already more than halfway there. Today, they've got a world-class bakery called Zingerman's Bakehouse. They've got a fabulous restaurant called Zingerman's Roadhouse, which is the managing partner of which is a finalist for a James Beard Award. They've got an award-winning cheese and gelato company called Zingerman's Creamery. They've got a Zingerman's Coffee Roastery. They've just started a Zingerman's Candy Company. They've got a mail order business. They've got a catering business. They have all of these companies, and they call themselves today Zingerman's Community of Businesses. The thing that when I went to see them that really impressed me the most was the quality of the people that they were able to attract. I mean, they had people who had had good jobs in national accounting firms who'd taken a cut in pay and come to Ann Arbor in order to bake bread. They had entrepreneurs who were successful entrepreneurs who sold their companies in order to come and make cheese. They had people who'd worked for large companies who'd taken a dramatic cuts in salary in order to come and be part of this community. They had, in other words, a lot of mojo. So I wrote an article about them. And the article appeared in our January 2003 issue of Inc. magazine, and it was called The Coolest Small Company in America. And it got a big response from everybody. And one of the people who called up to talk to me was a publisher. And he said, I really love that article that you wrote about Zingerman's. I wonder if there are other companies out there like Zingerman's. And I said, what do you mean? He said, companies that have had the chance to get a lot bigger, a lot faster, but have chosen not to because they've had other goals that they considered more important. Now, I'd been at Inc. for about 20 years at that point, and I didn't know the answer to that question, but I thought it was a great question. So one thing led to another, and I wound up going to investigate this question to write a book about it. At the time, I have to say, I had no idea what I would find, whether there would be a lot of these communities, where they would be, what industries that they would be in. I just thought it was a very interesting question that I wanted to find the answer to. And I came up with a set of criteria. There were 6 of them. The first one was I wanted companies that had reached a crossroads and made a choice. In other words, they had gotten to that point, like Zingerman's, where they could get a lot bigger, a lot faster, but they decided not to because they had other goals they considered more important. Number 2, I wanted companies that were recognized by their peers as being among the best at what they did. In other words, if you asked people in the industry, including their competitors, what are the best companies out here, that company would be on the list. Number 3, I wanted companies that had been singled out by independent third parties for their greater contributions to the community. In other words, I wanted companies that had an impact beyond their industries on the world in which they lived. Number 4, I'd seen a lot of companies in my time at Inc. that had done great for 4 or 5 years, and they hit their first recession or their first bad spot, and then they got into all kinds of trouble. I wanted companies that had already experienced the ups and downs of business and had managed to remain profitable for that time. I wanted companies as well. I had to deal with the size issue. I came up with the idea that, okay, I wanted companies that what I called human scale. In other words, they were still small enough that the people at the top of the organization could know people at the bottom. That the CEO was still able to meet people and who were just coming into the organization, that people felt they had access to the top management. And finally, I wanted companies that had mojo. And as I say, I went out, didn't know how many I would find. One of the first things that I realized after doing some initial research, talking to a bunch of people, was that there were a lot more of these companies out there than I imagined. And what's more, they were in every industry and in every part of the country. And because there were so many of them, I was able to sort of pick and choose. And I wound up choosing 14. Here they are. Some of them you perhaps recognize. You notice the pig up there. Well, that pig was created by a wonderful computer special effects company in Hollywood called Rhythm and Hughes. They also did the Chronicles of Narnia. In fact, if you ever see animals talking in movies, the chances are that Rhythm and Hughes has had something to do with it. You know Cliff Bar, Balance Bar, Power Bar, Cliff Bar. Anchor Steam Beer is made by the Anchor Brewery in San Francisco. It really is the brewery that started the whole microbrewing revolution. There really weren't any microbrews before Anchor Steam Beer in bottles came out. Some of these companies you may not know the names of, but you know what they do. You notice that when you have a computer, the top doesn't go right down. That's because of something called a constant torque hinge. You all probably know this already. But there is a company that sort of pioneered the constant torque hinge, Rael Precision Manufacturing. It's an employee-owned company in St. Paul, Minnesota, just outside St. Paul. You know when a truck is backing up, it makes that beep, beep, beep sound. Well, believe it or not, there's one company that dominates the market for backup alarms. It's called the Echo Group, and they're located in Boise, Idaho. Another great company. So I had all these companies, and one thing they all had was lots of mojo. And the question I had was, okay, where did it come from? How are they able to generate this mojo? And I decided to answer that question by looking at what these companies had in common. And I came up, well, in the book I came up with 5 characteristics. Since the book came out, I discovered a 6th one, which is very, very important. If I were writing the book today, there would be another chapter in the book, but because you are here, you're going to actually get to hear what the 6th one is. So in any event, the first one had to do with the leaders. And one thing I found was that all of these people who ran these companies had a very clear idea of who they were, what they wanted out of business, and why. Ari Weinzweig, Paul Saginaw, Zingerman's are classic here. Ari basically said to Paul, look, it may be the right thing for us to franchise and go national and that sort of thing, but I don't want to spend my life on an airplane flying to Kansas City to see if the coleslaw is fresh. Well, he knew that. He knew what he wanted. The founder of Cliff Bar, Gary Erickson, he walked away from, on the morning of when his company was going to be sold, he walked away from a deal that was going to bring him with Quaker Oats to sell it to Quaker Oats for $120 million. He would have walked away with $60 million. He called it off because he decided that he didn't think it was right for his employees. Norm Brodsky, who I write Ping mentioned, who I write the column with in Inc. magazine. If those of you read that column, follow that column, you know the story about how he walked away from a deal to sell his company for about $70 million because he didn't think it was right for his employees. Fritz Maytag of Anchor Brewing was thinking of going public, called that off at the last second because he didn't think it was going to be right for the company. He wouldn't be able to maintain the quality that he'd had if he took that step. You can't make those decisions unless you know who you are, what you want out of business, and why. So that was the first characteristic. Second characteristic had to do with purpose. All of these companies had a higher purpose that went beyond getting big, being very profitable, or what have you. There was something else that these companies and their leaders felt that these companies were doing that was important and that they could get passionate about. And one manifestation of this was that all of these companies were deeply rooted in the communities in which they did business. It wasn't just that they gave back a lot to those communities, although they all did. It was also that the communities sort of shaped the personalities of these companies to the point where you couldn't imagine them being anyplace else. I mean, Anchor Brewing in San Francisco is part of San Francisco history. It was started during the gold rush. It's been through all of the earthquakes and fires and so forth. When you go there, and if you go to San Francisco, I would urge you to take the tour. You have to sign up in advance. You get a very interesting slice of San Francisco history along with great beer. But you can't, Anchor Brewing couldn't be in Kansas. You could have great beer in Kansas, but you wouldn't be Anchor Brewing. And that's what I found, again, with all of these companies, is that they sort of reflected their personalities reflected the places where they were located. The third had to do with the relationships with their customers and suppliers, which were very, very close and personal. That was what was particularly interesting to me, was how personal they made these contacts with their customers and suppliers. This is the backup alarm company, the Echo Group. Some of you may have read a book years ago called The Discipline of Market Leaders by Michael Tracy and Fred Wurtzma. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It was published, I think, in 1995, and it introduced the concept of value disciplines, and basically said that if you want to be really successful, you have to choose one of three value disciplines. Number one, you can come out with the best price. Number two, you can come out with the best product. Or number three, you can come up with the best overall solution. If you want to have the best price, then you need operational efficiency. And you need to have your costs way down. If you want to have the best product, then you need to be very innovative. In effect, you need to be ahead of your customers in terms of providing products that they don't even know they want yet. But if you want to provide the best overall solution, you need to be customer intimate. Echo is a company that decided at a point after it had started, it was a very successful company, that they wanted to be customer intimate. They read this book, and they made a conscious decision that that was what they were going to be, the customer intimate company in this space. And it basically required them to completely reinvent a successful company. And they did it brilliantly. An example of customer intimacy, most backup alarm companies have 30 or 40 products. They had 600. Why? Because they had engineered these pieces so that they were flexible and they could be adapted to the needs of specific customers. They changed their whole management structure. They changed the role of the engineering. I mean, they went from having 2 engineers when they were just a backup alarm company to having 18 engineers 10 years later in 2004. So, they also, I mean, I suspect one of the companies here may actually have invented it, but they had this engineering software that allowed their customers, they called it the Vault, and it allowed their customers to actually come in and work, the engineers of their customers to work directly with their own engineers on designs. I mean, Caterpillar, for example, was one of their big customers, and they would go back and forth in real time, developing the products that Caterpillar wanted. And I saw some version of this with all of the companies. Obviously, it was different depending on the kind of business you were in. One of the companies I wrote about in the book is a record company started by a singer-songwriter named Ani DeFranco, who was very successful and heavily courted by all the big record companies in the late 80s and early 90s. But she decided she didn't want to work for a big company, so she started her own called Righteous Babe Records. One of the things that they do is that whenever, a lot of these customers of Righteous Babe Records are fans of Ani DeFranco, and they write in thousands and thousands of letters and emails every year to the company. Well, every single person who writes to Ani's companies gets a handwritten response. Not necessarily not from Ani, needless to say, but from people they hire to do that. Why? Because they value the intimacy of that customer relationship. All of the companies that are involved. Zingerman's names sandwiches after customers. Norm Brodsky's company names aisles, streets in its warehouses after customers. So this was a theme that I found over and over again. Now, I will say that given that quality, the fourth characteristic was interesting. Namely, these were all companies in which the customer came second and the employees came first. When you think about it, it's not that hard to understand. After a company gets above a certain size, it's not the CEO, it's not the top managers who have the relationship with the customers and the suppliers, it's the employees. And it's very hard, if you want to make sure that your customers are well taken care of, you need to take care of your employees, because it's very hard for an employee to take care of somebody else if he or she doesn't believe that the company that they work for cares about them. I think one of the best examples of this is actually a company that's not in the book, but only for one reason. It's Springfield. It used to be called Springfield Remanufacturing Corporation. It's now called SRC Holdings. That guy in the middle is Jack Stack. I had written 2 books with Jack Stack, and I figured that after writing 2 books with him, I shouldn't put him in Small Giants as well. But a lot of the things that I found with the Small Giants, I'd first learned about by working with Jack at SRC. I mean, this is a company, just to give you a quick story, that was started during the recession of the early 1980s, and it was a desperation move. They were all working at a little factory in Springfield, Missouri, that was doing remanufacturing engines for International Harvester. Well, International Harvester, you may not remember, but if you do, it went in the course of 2 years from being in the midst of that recession, from being number 11 on the Fortune 500 to teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. And they were selling off factories and closing them down all over the place. So Jack went to his fellow managers and said, look, we're going to be out of a job. I mean, they had high unemployment. They didn't know what they were going to do. And so they put in a bid for the factory. And much to their astonishment, International Harvester actually accepted their bid. So these were not wealthy people. They sort of got together and they scrounged up $100,000 between them. They went out and borrowed $8.9 million. We're talking about a company that started with an 89-to-1 debt-to-equity ratio. When you have an 89-to-1 debt-to-equity ratio, you're not really alive. You're on life support. You're brain dead. And basically what they decided was, look, we cannot afford to run out of cash here. If we miss one payment, the bank is going to come in here and seize all our assets. In fact, the guy who'd done the deal for the bank, which I have to say was Bank of America, was fired the week before the deal was closed. And his successor did not want to do this deal for good reason. But he was afraid of getting sued, so they went ahead with it. So they said, look, there are two things we can't do. Number one, we can't run out of cash. And number two, we can't destroy ourselves from within. We can't start fighting among ourselves over resources, or we'll take the eye off the ball and we'll run out of cash, we'll miss our payment, and we'll all be out in the street. So they said, okay, how do we keep that from happening? They said, well, somehow we've got to let everybody in the company know where the cash is and have some voice in saying what happens with it. Well, how do you do that? Well, the only way they knew how to do that was with financial statements. So they proceeded to go out on the shop floor, and we're talking about remanufacturing, which is a business. Let me tell you, you don't get a lot of, Harvard graduates working on the shop floor at SRC. These are people with, dirt under their fingernails who work very hard. And a lot of them don't even have high school education. But they went to them and they said, look, forget everything you've heard about business. Forget about how it's complicated or you need some degree to understand. It's all a lot of baloney. Business is a game. And like any game, it's no more complicated than all those games that you bet on every weekend. But like any game, in order to play that game, you've got to get it. And in order to get it, three conditions have to exist. Number one, you've got to know what the rules are. Number two, you've got to get enough information so that you can follow the action and keep score. And number three, you need to have a stake in the outcome. You need to care whether or not you win or lose. And they basically said, we're going to set up this entire company around that principle. And they created what they called the great game of business. And as I said, I wrote 2 books with Jack about this, so I'm not going to go through them today. Let me just say that they, since then, what the effect of this was, and the effect of doing this year after year after year was, for one thing, they were able to reduce that debt. The value of their stock went through the roof. They continued to grow. Plus, they were training all these people in business. And that came in very handy because they decided to start other businesses. These are all companies that were spin-offs from the original company, SRC Heavy Duty. And those companies were run by people who had been trained at SRC. There were people who had been started out as janitors and as secretaries who became general managers of some of these companies. And that's, they created an environment in which people wanted to come to work every day, where people loved coming to work every day. And the result has been that they've gone from $16 million their first year to about $500 million now. I wrote an article about this. It was an interview with Jack. It's called Plan B. If you go to Google and search for Bo Burlingham and Plan B, it'll come up. It's about how they have done during the recession and basically how they had prepared for 30 years. Having started in a recession, they prepared for 30 years for the next one, and when it came, they were prepared. So that was the 4th characteristic. Now, the 5th characteristic is what I call the missing one, because I didn't discover it until I didn't really become aware of it, I should say, until after the book was written. But it's critical. Let me tell you how I became aware of it. It really had to do with the laptop hinge company. Around the time that the book came out, I began to realize, I realized that something was amiss at this company, because they had two CEOs, and I wrote to one of them, and I got an email back from a home email address. So I called up the other one. I said, "What's going on? Well, what happened to Steve?" He said, "Well, Steve was fired, and it was announced the board fired Steve. The founders who were there in the corner had all left the board, but the board went ahead and they fired him. They announced it by email throughout the organization. Steve is now suing the company." I said, "Wow, this doesn't sound like Mojo to me." And I was determined that I was going to find out what happened, because I felt a sort of an obligation, having written glowingly about Rael in my book, to get to the bottom of this. I had to wait until the lawsuit was solved, and then I went in. And essentially, what happened was that this company made one fateful decision. When in the 1990s, laptop manufacture moved offshore, and the decisions about who was going to supply what moved to Asian companies. In other words, they had customers that were Compaq and Apple and IBM and so forth, but now they were having to deal with manufacturers in Asia. The question was, would they go into this market? Would they pursue it? They were nervous because they knew it was an intensely competitive market, and that they were going to be going up against local suppliers. But they felt that if they didn't go after it, they might have to have a layoff, and they'd never had a layoff. So they went after it. And what happened was that initially they did great. The sales came through so strongly that their market share went up to 25% of the global market for laptop hinges. They built a whole building, put $1 million into a new wing of their building. They hired, they bought all the equipment that needed to be in it. They hired the people and so forth. The next year, they lost, 30% of their sales. And they found that they were in this situation where they were being whipsawed. What's more, because they had invested in this so much money in expanding their capacity, they went from a situation where they were struggling to keep up with the demand for their products to one where they needed those orders. And that put them in a very disadvantageous position. It allowed their customers to beat them down on price. When I was there visiting them, they were actually selling more laptop hinges than any other time in their history, and they were losing money on them. And believe me, there was no Mojo anywhere to be seen. I came away, I wrote the article, I wrote what happened. It's a sad story, but a very instructive one. And I realized that I'd left something out in the book. I hadn't focused on the fact that all of these companies had sound business models, and they protected their gross margins. And so that became the sixth, it's the additional one, the missing one. The final factor, which was in the book, had to do with the owners and leaders. How are we doing for time? Okay. The owners and leaders of these companies and how they felt about what their businesses did. Basically, they were in love with what their businesses did. They were completely passionate about it. They were so crazy about what their businesses did that they wanted everybody they came into contact with to feel exactly the same way. Let me tell you a story, actually, something briefly that I learned from the founder of Inc. magazine, who was a guy named Bernie Goldhirsch. He was a guy, he was actually trained as an engineer himself. He went to MIT. When he got out of MIT, he decided that what he really wanted to be was a sailor. So he went down to the Caribbean, and he began knocking around the Caribbean, teaching people how to sail. Eventually, he decided he needed a source of income, and so he started a newsletter for people who love to sail. That newsletter became a magazine called Sail Magazine, and it was the first four-color glossy magazine strictly for people who were sailors. And suddenly Bernie found himself in business. Well, he'd never intended to get into business. And he had all these questions about, how do you hire people? How do you fire people? How do you deal with your banker? How do you handle this, that, and the other thing? And he looked around for answers in the major business magazines, and they were writing about how U.S. Steel was having problems with the United Steelworkers, and he said, this doesn't apply to me. And so he figured there must be other people like him, so he started a magazine, and entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship became his passion. And his view of them was shaped by an experience he'd had in college when he'd taken a semester off to go work for Dr. Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid camera and the founder of the Polaroid Corporation. And he was there, and he had a wonderful time, and he came out of it with this deep appreciation of what entrepreneurs do. He said, somebody goes into a garage, they go into a kitchen, they go into a bedroom, and out comes this entity that employs people, that allows those people to raise families, send their kids to college, so forth, that provides great products and services to customers, that allows them to improve their lives, that buys from other companies, which allow them to do the same thing, that contributes to the tax base, and so, makes the community stronger. Basically, he came away with this appreciation of entrepreneurship as a profoundly creative endeavor. And he used to tell us, those of us who were working on the magazine, that when we write for the readers of Inc. magazine, we should imagine them as artists using both sides of their brain. In other words, we weren't just writing for the numbers person. We were also writing for somebody with the soul of an artist whose means of expression happens to be business. And that is exactly what I found with all the companies in my book. That's what they were. I mean, you talk to Fritz Maytag about beer. He knew nothing about beer when he bought Anchor Brewing in 1976. Today, he will talk your head off about how hops transformed the industry and the role of pubs in spreading democracy in Northern Europe or whatever. This is Danny Meyer. If you spend any time in New York, you've probably eaten at one of his restaurants. His first two restaurants were Union Square Cafe and Gramercy Tavern. For the last 12 years, they've been the number 1 and 2 most popular restaurants in New York, in the entire city, for like 12 years, according to Zagat. He says, well, at a certain point, I discovered that I took a very intense, almost neurotic interest in watching people have a good time. And that's exactly what his restaurants are about, and that's why they are so published. Even Norm Brodsky. Now, Norm Brodsky is in the record storage business. You know what you do in the record storage business? You put boxes on shelves and you take them off shelves. How do you get passionate about that? Well, you talk to Norm, and he is passionate about it. He says he loves boxes. In fact, he loves nothing better than to go into his warehouse and smell the cardboard. And he's somebody who's totally passionate about, providing great service, having a great place to work, being a great citizen of the community, having a great life. I don't think any company or division or can have Mojo without leaders who feel that way about what it is that their organization does. You know, you'll hear advice to the contrary. You'll hear people say, never fall in love with your business because then you can't be objective about it. I think it's a lot of baloney, and so do the people in my book. You know, basically, if you don't love your business, if you don't think that you're contributing something great and unique to the world, well, nobody else is going to feel that way either. Now, of course, in startups, everybody has that feeling. You know, what sets the small giants apart is their ability to hold on to it, their refusal to let go of it. So how do they do that? Well, number one, they understand that you cannot measure the greatness of a business by its size or its rate of growth or its profitability. Those things, you know, its ability to consistently deliver good returns and to maintain a good rate of growth will tell you a lot about the skill of the management team. And I don't diminish that in any way. I mean, these companies wouldn't do well if they didn't have skillful management. But they don't tell you whether or not that company is contributing something great and unique to the world. After all, there are lots of businesses out there that are growing very fast and that are very profitable and that are a blight on humanity. Think of the drug cartels. So what do the small giants do? They decide that instead they're going to focus on the relationships that they have with all the groups of people that they come into contact with, whether it's employees, customers, suppliers, what have you, community. Why? Well, in part, of course, because those relationships are rewarding in and of themselves. But also, the strength of those relationships is the best measure that you're ever going to get of your ability to inspire other people. And basically, if all those groups of people feel as passionate about the business as the owner or the leader, you know, that business or that organization is going to have a lot of mojo by definition. And the chances are it's going to do pretty well financially as well. The challenge, of course, is to hold on to it. You know, the problem is that all of those relationships depend on a level of mutual trust and respect that's easily lost. All it takes is a little distraction. And I think this is really the big challenge, particularly for companies with outside investors. Because when you take somebody's money, you've got an obligation to give them, you know, what you promised them, which is a good rate of return. And they will make sure that you do that. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it does introduce a factor which I think leads a lot of companies to take their eye off the ball and to lose their mojo. So I guess what I'm saying here is that greatness and the mojo that comes with it is not a destination, it's a journey. You know, those things that, you know, the greatness, you know, those qualities, you know, have to be constantly nurtured and protected, or they will go away. Now, let me just wind up quickly, and then we can get to questions about why I think all of this is so important. You know, businesses are the building blocks not just of an economy, but of a whole way of life. What they do and how they do it shapes the communities we live in, the values we live by, and the quality of the lives that we lead. Companies that don't hold themselves to a high standard, when they don't hold themselves to a high standard, has ramifications throughout the society. There are no companies that hold themselves to a higher standard than the small giants. What's more, it's a standard that every business of any size can aspire to, and a lot of them can achieve. And the more that do, the better off we will all be. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Thank you very much. And we do have a little time for questions. or comments, frankly? Yes. Okay, yeah. You're all over the place. Okay, the question is, it's a very good one. How do you develop the community aspect of Mojo when, in fact, your workforce is all over the world? And your customers are all over the world. Well, this is what I would call the wonders of technology. You know, the companies that I know that do this, I don't particularly, I'm not particularly familiar with necessarily with the companies you're specifically talking about, but I know lots of companies that are, distributed far and wide. And you come up with mechanisms to do that. I know a truck company which was asking the question, how do we get our truckers to be part of this whole thing? Well, they gave them phones. They gave them the wherewithal so that they could, they could have their weekly meetings and so forth. And in terms of the local community, ultimately this has got to come from the inside out. It's got to come from the people themselves. And if I was on the board of the Body Shop, which is, for 5 years, which is the cosmetics company. Now they were a franchise company, obviously, and they had franchises all over the world. Well, the example that was set by the central company inspired everybody else. And so they were doing things, all of the franchisees were doing things locally with or without the knowledge and approval of the central office, because it was one of the core values of the company. I knew in Boston, where I was living at the time, that if I was working on a charitable event and we needed support for it, the first place we would always go was to the Body Shop franchise. Well, that's how it works. Now, at that point, the Body Shop had a lot of mojo. It happened, unfortunately, to be a company that lost its mojo, but not because it was widely distributed. I don't know if that addresses your question or not. I don't have a pat a question. I mean, I think it's the sort of thing where each case is different. I mean, if you look at the companies in my book, although I look at what they have in common, what is most striking is how different they are. They're in different businesses. They have different demands. The people who have come to this have come from very, very different roots, but they've all wound up in more or less the same place. I don't believe in sort of I don't think it's possible really to come up with a one-size-fits-all sort of step-by-step goal. There are certain things that you can grade yourself on, and that's something that we're working on with the Small Giants community, but ultimately it's, every company for itself. Yes?
Thank you for all this. To me, I want to report that your visuals extol growth, size, whereas what you're telling me, I believe, is that the metric for Mojo is the temperature of the employees.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I want to be very clear about something. Oh, excuse me. You were saying that the metric, that my visuals extol size, whereas the key metric is the temperature of the employees. It's the temperature of all the different groups involved. I wouldn't say, I'm not sure I know what you mean by extolling size. All of the companies in my book are growing. At no point in Small Giants do I say that in order to be great, you have to be small, or that in order to be great, you have to make this decision. I don't believe that. I don't think that's true. In order to have Mojo, I believe, you need to have these other qualities. And those other qualities you can have regardless of the size of the business. In other words, it is the temperature of the employees. It is also the relationships that you have with customers and the way that you treat customers. It is also your relationship to the community in which you do business. And, it's having a good business model and so forth. Yes? Well, the best example, this is, he asked for an example of companies that have lost their mojo and were able to get it back. Probably the best example of that is Cliff Bar. Cliff Bar was a company that, I'll tell you the story very quickly. Cliff Bar was a company that was started in the late 1980s by Gary Erickson, who, he wanted to invent an energy bar that tasted good. And so he did, and the company took off. It was 5 times consecutive years in the Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing private companies. And then in the late 1990s, its 2 biggest competitors were bought by Kraft and Nestle. And basically they were suddenly competing against these huge companies. And then they got an offer from Quaker to buy the company. And initially, he accepted it. He went to his employees, said, look, I'm going to do this, but I'm only going to do this because I want to protect your jobs. I want to protect the brand. So the deal went through. There was a lot of negotiations. They worked out all the details. They got ready to close the deal. He's standing in his office. He suddenly gets a panic attack because Quaker has told him that after they signed the deal, they're going to move the company from Berkeley to the Midwest, and they don't want Gary and his partner to have anything to do with it. So now he's lied to his employees. So he's feeling terrible. His hands are sweating. He's having a hard time breathing. He says to his partner, I've got to get some fresh air. He goes out. He starts walking around the block. Gets halfway around the block. He feels so bad about what he's going to do that he bursts into tears. Then he walks a little bit further, and he thinks, wait a minute, I haven't signed anything. Suddenly he feels better. He goes walking back to his office. He goes in. He tells his partner, forget it. We're not selling this business. Send them away. Now, his partner was sort of counting on the $60 million at that point, and wasn't all that thrilled about it. And eventually he wound up having to pay her off, actually. It cost him $80 million. But, he was right. Everybody was telling him he was crazy. Not only did he have these huge competitors, but now he saddled himself with all this debt. Well, in the course of the next 3 years, they tripled in size. One of the things they did was that he was the one who gave me the term mojo, because he was at a trade fair afterwards, and somebody came up to him and was pointing to the balance bar booth, and he said, you guys are great. Look at all the energy around here. They lost their mojo. So he got the idea, oh, mojo, that's something important. I probably should think about that. And when he went to his employees and asked them, well, do we have mojo? A lot of them came back and said, we lost it. In the run-up to the sale, there was no mojo here. Everybody was afraid of what was going to happen. And they had to work very hard to get it back. So what do? Well, number one, you work on those. You go back to working on those relationships with, employees, customers, suppliers, community. And you go to to Cliff Bar now, and now, of course, sometimes when you lose your mojo, things happen, and it's hard to get it back. I don't know Apple Computer that well. I do know that there was a time when it had a lot of mojo in the beginning. That was right around the time Inc. was started, and then it lost it all. And then when Steve Jobs came back, it seems to have gotten it back. I don't know intimately that company, but there's an example. And it comes from being great, trying to be great, creating a great environment where people feel challenged. I know in certain businesses, particularly creative businesses like the ones you're in, one element of having a great workplace is giving people great problems to work on and the wherewithal to do great work. And that's a great motivator, certainly for a magazine, and also, I'm sure, for the companies that you work for. Brad?
Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. I will be around to sign books.
Bo will be around all day.
Yeah, I'll be around all day, and I'd be happy to sign books or talk to you or answer questions or whatever.
So one of the points that I wanted to make about Bo's presentation is that not all of the companies in this room are small, but all of the companies in this room that aren't small have customers that are in small and medium businesses and need to facilitate making them great, as you talked about with Echo and its suppliers. Anyway, I want to give Bo one more round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.